first of 4 video lectures on the United States Constitution. In this video lecture, we're going to examine the compromises over representation at the Constitutional Convention. The other 3 lectures will look at different aspects of the American system of government. The second one will look at the system of checks and balances. The third will look at the system of federalism, where power is divided between the national and state and local governments. And the fourth one will look at the process of the Constitution's ratification and the passage of the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, commonly known as the Bill of Rights. So let's begin and look at the agenda for this video lecture. We're going to look at theories of representation and particularly contrast 2 ideas, the equity principle, which is sometimes stated as one person, one vote, and the contribution principle, which means representation should be proportional to your contribution to the Commonwealth. We're also going to look kind of as a sub-issue of how votes are turned into seats, meaning votes by the public are turned into seats in the legislature. We live in a representative democracy, which means people don't actually make directly every decision made by the government. We elect representatives who then represent our interests in a national legislature, and therefore they pass policies. But how do you translate our votes at the voting booth into individual representatives, whether it be House of Representatives or senators, in the national government? Next, we're going to look specifically at 2 major plans considered at the Constitutional Convention by how to decide how people would be represented in the national government. These plans are known as the Virginia Plan, favored by large population states, and the New Jersey Plan, favored by smaller and also small population states. These were brought together in what was called the Great Compromise, which is the basis for our Congress and our legislature in the national government, which has 2 houses, sometimes called as bicameral or bicameralism. The Senate, where there's equal representation, where each state is allocated 2 senators apiece, and the House of Representatives, where each state has a set of representatives proportional to the population of that state. This system, particularly the Senate, leads to a lot of inequalities in representation, because we have different sized states. Having the same representations from each state, 2 senators, means that small states get more senators relative to their population than large states. We're going to take a look at this in terms of game theory, which is a field of economics that tries to understand different institutions in terms of small, simple games. And we're going to look at Arrow's impossibility theorem and the liberal paradox of the Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen. Finally, we're going to look at the other major compromise between northern and southern states, called the 3/5 compromise. It's called the 3/5 compromise because it weighted the African American slaves as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation and taxation. Obviously, this was a great inequality, especially because African American slaves did not vote and really were not voting for themselves, but they were still counted for the purposes of representation. And this gave the southern states a lot of power in the early republic. But we're going to contrast this, the Great Compromise, which led to inequality in the Senate, with the inequality of the 3/5 compromise as a way of closing out this video lecture. So let's begin. There are 2 general principles of representation. The one that is intuitive to us today is the equity principle, where all citizens have the same power. One person, one vote. I have a vote, you have a vote, the richest person in the country also has a vote. Each of us only has one vote, and our votes are counted the same. While this is common today and makes sense within the democracy that we live in at the end of, the beginning of the 21st century, it wasn't so at the time of the Constitution. The Constitution really doesn't tell you who is eligible to vote, how votes will be counted. What the Constitution does, it says, well, we're going to allocate 2 senators per state and a certain number of representatives based on population to each state. But we're going to leave it to the state to say who's eligible and how they're going to conduct the elections and votes. And the states generally defer to county boards of elections on this. And so really the Constitution is not specific about who can vote, how the votes are carried out, and how they're aggregated to have winners. And this is different in different states, even to this day. It's also that not everyone voted at the time of the Constitution, and elections were relatively rare. For example, in the state of Rhode Island, even white men did not gain the universal right to vote until after Dorr's Rebellion in the 1840s. So because there was a property qualification. If you didn't have enough property, you didn't have a right to vote. So even if we don't include the most obvious cases of who's kept from voting, meaning women and African Americans at this time, there were still other groups that were restricted from voting, and sometimes it even hold elections. What you had is maybe in some cases a state legislature got together and said, well, we decided to cast our votes for candidate X, and that would be how the decision was made. So the equity principle treats all citizens as equal, but should they all be treated equal? Because some citizens pay more in taxes, which means the decisions use more of their money or money gathered from them in terms of tax revenues, should they have a greater say because more of their money is being spent to support the decisions of the government. It's also the case that some people have more to lose, whether they have more to lose because of poor decisions of the government or that the government, the majority of the people, might decide to confiscate some of their personal property to be used for the common purpose. And therefore, shouldn't they have more to say as a way to stop, let's say, stop the majority from running roughshod over their interests? And there's always been an implicit that the people who serve the country, whether they're in the military or law enforcement, are somehow uber citizens, that they are entitled to greater respect or a greater say in decisions because of their service to the country or service to the community. And this is from, you have this in the early republic where Jefferson and Madison are annoyed that the IOUs written to continental soldiers are not going to be redeemed at face value, while Hamilton said whoever's the holder of the bond should get that. But you even get this today where the respect shown to the military or special services provided for the military or the ease by which military are allowed to register to vote gives them some advantages relative to maybe the average citizen. So the contribution principle, though, is usually invoked in terms of property, which those who have more property should have a greater say. And when you have two houses in the legislature, usually one of those houses represents landed property or the aristocracy, such as the House of Lords in England or the Senate in the United States. Because power is based upon property, and from property is the tax revenues, and if you contribute more tax revenues, then maybe you should have a larger say. And the reason, maybe the justification for this is that if you have a pure democratic system, a single chamber, the majority could confiscate the minority's property, because property is usually concentrated in the hands of a smaller group of people, and therefore the majority would benefit by just taxing that small group and then redistributing all that wealth to the whole population. And to prevent that from happening, you might need to give the minority some extra representation. Finally, there's oftentimes geographical interests that need to get represented, such as subnational states or ethnic groups who are permanent minorities in the country who have a distinct thing but are still part of the country, meaning they have their own culture, they have their own government, and so you might have to represent them in a particular way. One example of this are, let's say, the three estates in pre-revolutionary France, where the nobles were an estate, the clergy were an estate, and the general population was an estate. And each of them had their own, let's say, chamber for representation. And so this is not, let's say, a novel thing. It's happened in many different places throughout history, but it kind of goes against our idea of one person, one vote, which is common to this day. The second kind of issue is how you turn votes into seats. And there's two basic ways to do this. The first is common in English-speaking democracies, such as England and the United States, and the other is more common in Western Europe and other major industrialized democracies of the world, which is called proportional representation. In English-speaking countries, the idea of the majority rules is very closely to their idea of democracy. And this system is called majoritarian, but it sometimes goes by the name first past the post or winner take all. And the idea is that you have geographically defined districts, and in these districts you select one representative. And whoever gets the majority of that district gets to choose the representative from that district. So whoever can get 50 plus 1 or gather the most votes in this district is elected. And this gives states a lot more power because states are basically a district. So we're not asking who has the majority in the country, we're saying who has the majority in Ohio, or New York, or California, or Michigan. And so this gives more power to the states because you're basing it on a majority within a geographically described district. Now, it's called winner take all because whoever gets the most votes gets all the representation. So you can have a situation where it's really a split vote, i.e. someone gets 50% or 51% and someone else gets 49%, and the 51% get 100% of the representation, while the 49% on the losing side get zero representation. And that's why it's called winner take all. The winner gets all the representation. The other system is called proportional representation, and this means the percent of seats in the legislature is roughly equivalent to the percent of votes, although there's lots of small little sub-rules for different systems of proportional representation. And in these systems, basically, you don't really vote for individual representatives often, but you vote for a political party. And they might have a list, and depending whether that party gets more votes, they get more people from their list elected to the legislature. And this gives people a lot more power because no matter where you're living, your vote counts the same as someone living in a more competitive state. And so people are more likely to vote and also more likely to choose different parties that are closer to them because you don't need to select just the winner or the first runner-up. The other problem with majoritarian and geographically based districts, sometimes called single-member districts, is the possibility of gerrymandering. And we can see this by the diagram at the bottom of this slide. So let's imagine a system where there's 50 people, 60% support the blue party and 40% support the red party, which means the representatives that come out of this should be roughly a 60-40 blue-red split. If we had a perfect representation system, such as proportional representation, and we had 5 representatives from this 50 group of people, you should have 3 blue representatives and 2 red representatives. And you can do that by dividing it so. 3 districts that are all blue and 2 districts that are all red basically leads to a fraction of representatives that's equivalent to the fraction found in the general public. However, you could divide this into 5 districts that are compact and unfair by dividing it differently, where you have 5 districts where the vote is 3-2 or 60-40 in each of those districts favoring the blue party, resulting in 5 blue districts and no red districts. So the 40% who red have no representation under this. However, it's not simply just unfair to the red or the minority, because you could draw districts where actually you could flip the proportion of representatives relative to the voters in the population by gerrymandering, by drawing the districts in odd ways. Basically putting 2 districts that have almost all the blue representatives and having 3 districts where there's a slight majority for the red. And so what you could get is an outcome where there would be 3 red districts and only 2 blue districts, despite the fact that there are more blue voters in this area. And a good example of this is what happened to Ohio. Now, in 2008 and 2012, Obama won Ohio, and therefore you would think that Democrats would have the majority of House seats in Ohio, since Obama won a little over 50% of the vote. In fact, Republicans won 75% of all the House seats, and partially this is because of how the districts were drawn. As you can see, there's a few blue districts, and they tend to be very convoluted shaped districts and not kind of what we think is simple, compact districts. And as a result, most of the Democrats were found in those blue areas, and the remaining districts were safely Republican districts, and therefore they were able to get 3/4 of the district where they got less than half of the votes. So let's go back to the Constitutional Convention and look at the Virginia Plan. So there were the Constitutional Convention. The Virginians arrived first, and they were led by James Madison, or at least James Madison was the mover behind the scenes, although this was proposed by, I believe, Edmund Randolph, who was a leader of the Virginia delegation. And Virginia was a large population state, actually larger than it is today. And as a result, they wanted proportional representation. They had more people, and therefore, under a proportional scheme, they would have more seats in Congress if it was based upon population alone. In addition, James Madison, who was from Virginia, favored more central authority over local power. There are several reasons for this. One was that he was frustrated with local state governments and he wanted to take power out of their hands. But also he understood at the center level, because Virginia was a large population state, even if Virginia gave up its power to the national government, Virginia would have a huge say in the affairs of the national government, and therefore Virginia would not lose as much by ceding some of the power to the national government. So they favored that they would take power from states and localities and give it more to this new federal government that they were considering on the Constitutional Convention. There were several other aspects of that. He had an executive, not called the president at that time, and instead it was limited to one term, but the term was longer than the 4-year term that presidents serve today. But instead of being selected by the Electoral College or by direct vote of the people, the president would be chosen by the Senate. It did have what was called a bicameral legislature. Camera means room or chamber in Italian, bi meaning two. So bicameral means two chambers or two houses. So a bicameral legislature is a legislature with two houses, such as the House of Commons and the House of Lords in England, or in the United States, the House of Representatives and the Senate. One will be chosen by the state legislatures of each of the states, and the other one will be chosen directly from the people. It also had kind of a different thing called a Council of Revision, and this was sort of like the Supreme Court, and it sort of anticipated the idea of judicial review. So the president, in conjunction with basically the Supreme Court, would create a Council of Revision, and they would be able to veto legislation coming from the legislature, but they could also overturn both national and state laws that they considered unwise. Now, this was different than ruling on the constitutionality of legislation, meaning, did it fit the rules of the Constitution? They could reject it for any reason, just meaning that we think this is a bad policy or we could have a better legislation, and they could change or reject legislation passed by the popularly elected portions of the government in the legislature. So this was the basis of the Virginia Plan. And once again, it reflects James Madison and his dissatisfaction with state governments. That's why we have a council revision that would be able to overturn legislation, and also the idea that Virginia would have a lot of power in the national government, and therefore they were not afraid to give the government more power. Now, this was opposed by the New Jersey Plan, and in standard accounts, the New Jersey Plan is considered like a competitor to the Virginia Plan. But in fact, it's likely that it was proposed to be such a bad plan that it would make the not so popular Virginia Plan more thinkable among small states. And what do I mean by that? William Paterson, who proposed the New Jersey Plan, was actually well known to James Madison and was a supporter of the federal government. So it's unlikely that he was really pushing for a strong version of a small state plan. But he understood that many small states had reasons to not like the Virginia Plan because they might lose their identity as small states swamped by larger states like New York and Virginia. However, he did want a national government, and he did agree with Madison on a lot of the aspects of the Virginia Plan. So he basically proposed a New Jersey Plan, which was very similar to the existing Constitution, Articles of Confederation, which the Constitutional Convention was convened to overturn. The New Jersey Plan basically adopts the Articles of Confederation and just changes it just a little bit. So it's called the New Jersey Plan because William Paterson was from New Jersey, and he is the namesake for this city, both for William Paterson University, but also the city of Paterson, New Jersey, in New Jersey. And he later became a Supreme Court justice under the original United States after post the Constitution. New Jersey was a small population state, and therefore they were going to be overwhelmed by larger states like New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. And so what they wanted was equal representation, meaning every state had the same say, whether it was large or small. So New Jersey would have the same power as larger states like Virginia, Pennsylvania, and New York. They also wanted a unicameral legislature. Once again, camera is Italian for chamber or room. Uni means one. It means one chamber in the legislature. Several things that were similar to the Articles of Confederation. Instead of voting as individual representatives, they would cast their votes as states, which means there might be 5 representatives from New York State. They wouldn't be able to vote 5 different ways. What would happen is the New York delegation would get together, they would talk amongst themselves, and then they would say who has the majority within the 5 from New York. And if it was 3-2, then whoever the 3 would cast the 1 vote for New York in one direct, either affirming or negating whatever legislation was. So this gave more power to the states and away from representing the people, and also the power of individual legislators. And very often what you needed under the system for many important votes was a 9-vote supermajority. So it wasn't just 50% or 50% plus 1. You needed like 9 of the 13 original colonies to pass major legislation. In addition, the representatives of the national government will be chosen by state legislatures, not the voters directly, which means there would be kind of a buffer between popular control in terms of the state legislatures selecting the individuals who would make it to the National Congress. It also had many features that split responsibilities for the courts, meaning state courts and national courts, giving some legal powers and jurisdiction to the national government and keeping others to the states. Um, in the military, officers above the rank of colonel would be appointed by the national government, but below the rank of colonel, they'd be appointed by the state government. And that it would have a common treasury, but it would be in proportion to the population of each state. The last thing that differed from the Virginia plan is that it recommended relatively short terms of office, meaning that representatives would be kind of amateurs. They would be there for a very short period of time. They would not. They would be closer to the state governments because they would not spending a lot of time together with other legislators in the national government. And I think that was an important thing, although it's not emphasized that much in the standard account of the Constitutional Convention. So this was a big impasse, and originally they tabled it, and it was hard to resolve because there really was a difference in interest. Small states did not want to give up power. But a compromise was proposed by Roger Sherman from Connecticut, and Roger Sherman is a relatively interesting person. He's one of the few people to sign the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution. And the compromise adopted parts of the Virginia Plan and parts of the New Jersey Plan to create our current system of Congress. From the Virginia Plan, it adopted the bicameral legislature, two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate, and it allowed for the Virginia way of representation to exist in the House of Representatives. So each state would get a number of representatives based upon its population in the House. From the New Jersey Plan, it adopted the idea of equal representation in the Senate, but instead of each state getting one vote, there were two senators from each state. And also kind of a derivative of this is the idea of an electoral college, which you would have kind of the president elected by a group that was kind of intermediate between the people and the executive. So this was the system. The compromise worked. It brought all people along and got most states to, and particularly the southern states were many of the first adopters or ratifiers after the Constitution was proclaimed in September of 1787. However, despite its name, it might not be such a great compromise, because states with smaller population than the county that I'm in, Westchester County, New York, there are 7 states that have smaller populations in this one county of New York: Wyoming, Vermont, North Dakota, South Dakota, Alaska, Montana, and Delaware. And between these 7 states, they have 14 senators. Westchester County, which has a population of around 1 million, um, gets no senators. It's just a part of a larger state, and there's no senator that comes from our county in particular. However, these 7 states that have in some cases significantly less population have 14 senators among them, which means they have about 1/7 of all the representation. Imagine if Westchester County was 1/7 of the representation for the whole country. Another way of thinking about this is that it would take 21 states to total 39 million people. If you took 50% of those 39 people, the majority of those 21 states, that's about 19 million people. And that's equivalent to the current population of New York State. So those 21 states get 42 senators, which is nearly a majority of the Senate, while the 19 people of New York State only get 2 senators. And this is a problem with the inequality. It allows for small states to have a huge impact on legislation because they can essentially stop legislation. And this little chart on the right shows you where the districts from the Republicans who wanted to defund Obamacare after around the time of the 2012 election. And you can see they mostly come from red states or red districts that are Republican and strongly Republican from states that also uh, 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 tended to be Republican. Some of these states are relatively small, and many of them are concentrated in the South and the Middle Midwest, meaning Indiana, uh, Western Michigan, and Western Ohio. Um, but imagine, for example, if you could get a few small states that could be able to stop legislation that's favored by the majority of the country and the majority of the population and the majority of the legislators. way of thinking of this is what's called Arrow's impossibility theorem. And imagine, for example, we're a small democracy and we need to choose one policy. In this case, we're going to choose one ice cream for a class. And imagine we have three voters, Abigail, Brittany, and Camille. And each of them has a different preference about what they want to choose. Abigail prefers vanilla to chocolate and chocolate to strawberry. Brittany likes strawberry the best, followed by vanilla, and her least favorite is chocolate. Camille, chocolate is her favorite, followed by strawberry, followed by vanilla. Now, if they were to have a simple vote, you would get a three-way tie. You would get one vote for vanilla from Abigail, one vote for strawberry from Brittany, and one vote for chocolate from Camille, which means there'd be no majority. So imagine that they had to break this tie. What would they do? Well, they could have kind of a tournament where, first of all, you had two choices, and then the winner of that first choice goes against a third option, and the winner of that would be the final selection. So imagine we had vanilla versus chocolate as our first opposition. Abigail would vote for vanilla because that's her first choice. Um, Brittany would vote for vanilla because she prefers vanilla to chocolate, even though it's not her first choice. And Camille would vote for chocolate because it's her first choice. It would be 2-1. Vanilla would win, and then vanilla would go up against strawberry. And in this case, Brittany would vote for strawberry as her first choice. Camille would vote for strawberry because she prefers it to vanilla. And Abigail still voting for vanilla as her first choice, but strawberry would win. Now, this might seem to be a reasonable way to make this choice, but if we change the order, we can get a different outcome. For example, if we have vanilla versus strawberry, we know what happens here. Strawberry is going to win. Let's put strawberry versus chocolate, but in this case, chocolate wins and we get a different outcome. So if we change the order by which we consider our choices, we can actually change the outcome of a democratic process, even though no one changed their mind and everyone has the same amount of power. And this is why we're talking about the structuring of choices, that the Senate is not simply democratic. By having people selected in a different way, you can get a different outcome than what the majority really wanted. And finally, just to show you that there's one other way, if you just started with strawberry versus chocolate, chocolate would win that, and then if chocolate versus vanilla, vanilla would be the choice. So you could get almost any outcome you wanted by structuring the choices differently. And this is named after the Nobel Prize winner in economics, Kenneth Arrow. And the idea is that whenever you have three voters and three choices, which is almost every single decision made in a democracy, it's impossible to have a single preferable outcome. And what happens is whoever controls the process controls the outcome. And because you have a bicameral legislature, you open up the door for more manipulation of the process, which means very often the majority will not get what they want because it's not a direct democracy and there's not, let's say, two choices presented to people. The other one I want to show you is something called the liberal paradox, and this comes from the economist Amartya Sen. And this is basically trying to explain why sometimes if you give everyone free choice, you're not going to get the best outcome in terms of making the most people happy. So imagine we have a couple, Jack and Jill, and they're trying to make a decision to do something on the weekend, and they're considering whether to go see a chick flick like the movie The Notebook. So let's examine what they would want. Now, let's say Jill would like to go see the movie, and she would like to go see this movie with her boyfriend, but Jack would rather that she go by herself, and then he would have time to do something he would prefer to do. So Jack's preferences are first that Jill goes by herself. His second preference is that they both go together. His third preference is that neither of them go. And the last thing he wants to do is go by himself, because if he's not going with his girlfriend, why would he go see this movie that he doesn't want to see? Jill has a slightly different set of preferences. She would prefer that both go because she likes her boyfriend and she likes the movie, so that would be her first choice. Her second choice would be neither of them going because why go see a romantic movie all by yourself? Third, she would go by herself. And lastly, Jack goes because it's her favorite movie. What's the purpose of sending Jack to go see it by himself? Now, you would think that the common choice between these two people would be both goes because it's Jill's first choice and it's Jack's second choice. And in fact, that's the one that they prefer because you would get, if you look at it and we rank these 1 through 4, larger numbers for their higher choices so that they're a larger total sum. You would get 4 because it's Jill's first choice and 3 because it's Jack's second choice for a total of 7 combined between them. But that's not going to happen, and let me explain how. Well, we know if we look at the last choice, we know Jack is not going to go by himself because he would never, in a sense, initiate. He would never take that choice. So let's imagine that Jill makes the first move. She decides to go. If she decides to go, Jack's only choice is to go or not go. And he would prefer not to go because given that Jill is already going, he would rather not go and get his first choice instead of Jack's second choice to go. So he decides not to go. But now that he doesn't want to go, Jill is faced with a choice. She has to compare Jack not going, and she would rather not going to going by herself, 3 versus 2. So where you end up is in the bottom right column where neither of them go, which is only a total of 5 points, which is less than 7 points. So they each have free choices. If they can make their free choices, they're not going to end up in their best outcome, which is both of them going to see this movie. And this is that you can't have free choice and maximum happiness at the same time. And why this is a parable for the Constitutional Convention is that very often these compromises reflected that they first had to decide to have a government. Because one way to do this is to decide, well, we're going to go see this movie. If you presume we're going to both go see the movie, or Jack is going to the movie, or Jill is going to the movie, then you might be able to come to an outcome. Instead of neither of them going, and similar to having no government, they decided to have a government, but they had to compromise on some things that are maybe not very democratic, such as on an unequal system of representation in the Senate. And as we're going to talk about in a second, the Three-Fifths Compromise, which endorsed or permitted slavery as a compromise between the North and the South. They had to make these compromises as a way of forming a government. So they had to take away their free choice. And as a result, they got their best outcome, which was a national government, which, despite its flaws and despite its problems, which are not minor, they were able to overcome the divisions between the different colonies. So the Three-Fifths Compromise. The Three-Fifths Compromise was basically a compromise between the North and the South. The South wanted the slaves to count as 3/5 of representation, but they did not want to count them for the purposes of taxation. Now you might say, why do they want these slaves to count for representation? Do they want these slaves to vote? And the answer is no, they didn't want them to vote. But they wanted to get more representatives from the South, and they wanted to, but they didn't want to pay more money. And the way that taxes worked back then, because it wasn't a system of income taxes, is that each state had an allocation. If your state had a greater population, then you had to pay more for the federal budget. But this is not what the South wanted to do. They just wanted more say, but they didn't want to pay a proportional amount in terms of expenses. So the Three-Fifths Compromise was a compromise by saying we're not going to let you count the slaves as a full person. We're going to only count them as a 3/5 of a person, but we'll also give you this discount for the purposes of taxation. And so this was a compromise between the northern states that opposed slavery and the southern states who wanted to continue slavery as the basis for their southern economy. However, this gave southern planters, and particularly plantation owners, a lot of political power. First, because they had a lot of power within their southern colonies, but also because, since having more slaves, they effectively cast a vote for their slaves. And instead of getting one vote for every southern plantation owner, they were getting one vote and then plus 3/5 votes for every slave they owned. So they had more political voice based upon their ability to own people. And this seems kind of perverse from a modern perspective, but it's a little bit like this. So, for example, representation in the states, meaning how many representatives New York has versus California, is not based upon the number of voters. It's based upon the number of residents, which means when the census goes around and counts people, it also counts people who are residents, people who are not fully citizens, because they do have to benefit from some of the services, and therefore the allocation of benefits, when they count those things, comes from counting the total number of people in the state, not just the total number of citizens or the total number of voters. But what the outcome of this is that it helped the South control the federal government because the South basically had extra votes and therefore they had extra representation. And almost every president from Washington until Lincoln hailed from the South, with the exception of the Adams and a few others like Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan, who, despite being from the North, were very friendly to the South. You had basically the South controlling who was the chief executive. They controlled most of the major senators. They controlled the House of Representatives and the Speaker of the House of Representatives. And they had by far the largest number of Supreme Court justices during this period. And many people refer to Thomas Jefferson, a Southerner elected president, as a Negro president, not because, as we now know, he slept with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings, but because he was considered elected by these three-fifths Negro votes, which gave him the advantage over Northern candidates. Later, they wouldn't say Negro president; they would refer to it as a slave power. And they didn't mean the power over the slaves; they meant having slaves gave them more political power in the national government. And this became the basis for the issues leading up to the Civil War between the conflicts between the North and the South. Now, I just want to conclude by considering the Three-Fifths Compromise, which obviously endorsed slavery, a system of inequality, and also discounted the value of individual human beings, versus the inequality created by the representation of small states, meaning that small states get two senators, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, the same as very large states such as California, Texas, Florida, and New York. And I would say that in the final calculus, the Great Compromise might have had more problems, partially because the Three-Fifths Compromise is no longer in the Constitution. It went away with the Civil War and the revisions of the Constitution because of the three post-Civil War amendments, but also because it allows small states to have a say on every single policy from um, agricultural subsidies to social policy. And those inequalities continue to this day, and it was that inequality in the Senate that allowed the South to oppose civil rights legislation well after the Civil War, including a lot of anti-lynching legislation. And it might have been more detrimental, the inequality in the Senate, to preventing progress on civil rights than the Three-Fifths Clause, which only really mattered prior to the Civil War. Okay, I'm going to end this lecture here. Next time we'll come back, we'll talk about the system of checks and balances.